Did you know? There was a time when four-engine aircraft were the symbol of long-haul aviation. The 747 dominated the skies for decades. The A340 appeared on some of the most important intercontinental routes in the world. The A380 was expected to become the future of aviation, and yet today, most of them have disappeared from the very routes that once made their names. Some were discontinued, some quietly left airline fleets. Many people think the reason is simple. Fuel prices went up, airlines wanted to cut costs, or modern engines became more powerful than before. All of that is true, but it is only part of the story, because behind the disappearance of an entire generation of aircraft worth hundreds of billions of dollars lies something far less noticed. The cause was not in the sky. It began with a decision written into aviation regulations. A decision that, at the time, very few people thought would change the fate of almost every four-engine aircraft in the future. To understand why this happened, we have to go back several decades. In the 1960s and 1970s, flying across oceans was a completely different story from today. Back then, jet engines had not yet reached the level of reliability they have now. Although failures were very rare, aviation regulators still had to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Because if an aircraft encountered a problem in the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific, there were almost no nearby options for an emergency landing. And that was when an important rule came into play. Twin-engine aircraft were not allowed to fly too far from a suitable alternate airport. Put more simply, if airlines wanted to operate long-haul flights across oceans, two engines were not considered enough. Airlines needed aircraft with 3 or 4 engines to meet operational requirements. That is why names like the 747, DC-10, and L1011 quickly became the backbone of international routes. Even Airbus followed the same path many years later when it developed the A340, because at that time, the number of engines was not just a matter of performance. It determined where an aircraft was allowed to fly and how far it could go. For many years, this was almost an unquestioned principle, and very few people imagined that one day the foundation of this entire system would change. But then, something interesting began to happen. While the regulations remained almost unchanged, engine technology kept moving forward. By the 1980s, jet engines had become far more reliable than the previous generation. Serious failures became increasingly rare. And that led to a question that almost no one had seriously considered before. If modern engines had become that reliable, was it still truly necessary to require 3 or 4 engines for long-haul flights? That was when the aviation industry began to reconsider one of its most important assumptions. The result was ETOPS. The name sounds complicated, but the idea behind it is actually quite simple. In the past, twin-engine aircraft were limited in how far they could fly from an alternate airport because regulators were concerned about the possibility of losing one engine over the ocean. But as technology improved, regulators began asking a new question. If one engine could operate safely for tens of thousands of flight hours, were the old limits still necessary? ETOPS was the answer. At first, twin-engine aircraft were allowed to fly up to 120 minutes from an alternate airport with only one engine operating. Then it became 180 minutes, 240 minutes, 330 minutes. It may sound like just a few numbers on paper, but in reality, every time the limit was extended, twin-engine aircraft gained access to thousands of additional kilometers of sky that had once been out of reach. That meant more and more routes that were previously reserved for 3 or 4 engine aircraft could now be operated by twin-engine aircraft. And then the aviation industry realized something. The greatest advantage 4-engine aircraft had held for decades was no longer exclusive. A twin-engine aircraft could now cross the Atlantic, cross the Pacific, and even operate most of the world's most important long-haul flights. ETOPS did not eliminate 4-engine aircraft. But for the first time, it made people ask, if 2 engines could do the same job, why would you still need 4? This was when everything truly began to change. because as soon as ETOPS expanded, airlines quickly saw a very clear opportunity. Were 4 engines still worth paying for? Because each engine did not only produce thrust, it also brought higher costs, such as fuel and maintenance expenses, along with more potential risks throughout the aircraft's operating life. Airlines had accepted those costs because they had no other choice, but ETOPS changed that. Now, manufacturers no longer needed to add more engines just to fly farther. They could focus on building larger, more efficient, and more economical twin-engine aircraft. And then the Boeing 777 appeared. It became one of the first aircraft to prove that 2 engines could absolutely take on missions that had once belonged to 4-engine aircraft. Then came the 787, then the A350. Each new generation pushed the range limit even further, carrying more passengers while burning less fuel, and most importantly, delivering better economics for airlines. The consequences appeared very quickly. The A340 gradually lost its appeal as it had to compete with the more efficient 777. The 747 continued to fly, but more and more routes were transferred to newer twin-engine aircraft. Then came the A380, an aircraft designed for an era in which giant hub airports were expected to be the future of aviation. But by the time it entered service, the world had already begun moving in a different direction. Airlines wanted more flights, more flexibility, and more efficiency. In the end, even the greatest symbol of the 4-engine era could not reverse that trend. The MD-11 disappeared from the passenger market even faster, one by one. The icons of an era gradually left the stage. ETOPS never banned 4-engine aircraft, but it did something even more important. It made their strongest reason for existing disappear. Airlines were not the only ones to see this opportunity. Aircraft manufacturers saw it too, and they began adjusting their strategies. Airbus is a very clear example. In the 1990s, the company placed high expectations on the A340, a 4-engine aircraft designed to compete on long-haul routes. But just over a decade later, Airbus placed its future bet on the A350, a twin-engine aircraft. Boeing moved in the same direction, from the 747 to the 777, then the 787. Each new generation focused on engine efficiency rather than the number of engines. That was not a coincidence, nor was it a temporary trend. It reflected a reality that both Boeing and Airbus understood very clearly. As engine technology continued to improve, carrying extra engines no longer created an advantage that justified the costs they brought with them. Airlines do not buy aircraft because of the number of engines. They buy profitability. And when 2 engines can perform the same mission at a lower cost, the direction of the industry is almost decided in advance. The race was no longer about who had more engines. It became about who could carry passengers farther at a lower cost. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about this story is this. Aircraft like the 747 or the A340 did not become worse over time. They still did exactly what they were designed to do. What changed was the world around them. Technology kept moving forward. Old rules were gradually rewritten, and the economic equation airlines had to face was no longer the same as before. That is why some of the greatest icons in aviation history gradually left the skies, not because they failed, but because aviation had entered a different era. Perhaps that is the most special thing about ETOPS. It did not defeat 4-engine aircraft. It simply made the world need them far less than before.